This is the Week in Sustainability from Workiva Carbon, formerly Sustain Life. It's where our team of experts and practitioners share weekly insights and commentary to keep you up to date about all things sustainability.
Hello and welcome to the Week in Sustainability. I am Melissa Zucker, Senior Industry Principal in the Carbon Practice here at Workiva. And this week I have a couple of stories that I want to share. There was a lot of moving and shaking in the climate world this past couple of weeks. So 3 stories that I want to share. One, we've got a new acronym on the block in the voluntary framework world, the launch of the TISFD, the Task Force on Inequality and Socially Related Financial Disclosures. Go into regulation because that's a place where we always like to live. New regulation out of California, anchoring on climate. Governor Newsom signed into law a new bill, SB 219. And then finally, I will give a recap of New York City Climate Week, which I was so fortunate to be able to attend over last week. So let's kick it off first with our framework discussion. The TISFD. This launched at the tail end of September. And this will be a new framework. So far, they've just put together their steering committee and kind of their governance structure and board. But the intent here is to be a new framework that guides companies on how to disclose their financially material social risks. So the initiative is designed to help both reporting companies and investors communicate inequality and socially related impacts, their dependencies, risks and opportunities, and then thinking about that as it relates to governance, strategy, and management processes. So if that all sounds familiar to those that are involved in the voluntary framework place, you might be thinking, wait a second, aren't there some other T frameworks I recognize? That's right, TCFD, TNFD. You can think of this as a cousin to those. It is essentially taking the same guiding framework and principles and underlying structure, but applying it to these social risks. So stay tuned for more on that. But yep, that is an ever thickening of our acronym alphabet soup here in the world of ESG. So let's shift it over to the regulatory side. Governor Newsom signed into law SB Senate Bill 219 on September 27th. So this bill enacts several of the amendments from the Corporate Climate Data Accountability Act, SB 253, and the Climate Related Financial Act, SB 261. And it essentially is taking those two bills and consolidating them, but making a couple of changes. So let's talk about those key changes. We won't go into the background of SB 253 and 261 here. You can find a lot of content that we put out on those. I think I probably have those letters and numbers ingrained in my head at this point, but there were a couple of key distinctions here. So number one, a delay in CARB's reporting requirements. So previously, the California Air and Resource Board had until January 1st, 2025 to publish the rules of how companies are actually expected to disclose to them all of this climate-related and emissions information. That date has been pushed back 6 months. They now have until July 1st to release those reporting requirements. However, the timeline that has not been pushed back is when companies actually still need to disclose, and that remains January 1st, 2026. So that means there will only be 6 months for companies to read what CARB has said. Here's exactly how and what we need you to disclose until they're actually expected to furnish that information. So they'll be going into the first 6 months of that reporting year without an understanding of exactly what they're supposed to be doing. So time will tell how that goes, but that's the timing update there. Another update here was a pushback in requirements on Scope 3 reporting. And that's something that we have seen kind of consistently as a lot of these laws go through the legislative process and evolve and face pushback. This one isn't quite as dire, I think, as others have been, or as significant, I should say. So previously, companies had 180 days after they had disclosed their Scope 1 and 2 emissions to when they then had to disclose their Scope 3 emissions. The change that we see in SB 219 is it essentially gives CARB the latitude to dictate what that timeline may or may not be. So the 180-day requirement has been pulled back, and CARB can decide now when to require the companies to disclose the Scope 3 emissions. Another change here is that CARB was basically given a little bit more permissive authority. So where they previously had to engage these third-party climate reporting organizations to fulfill certain obligations, that has been removed, and they can now assume these responsibilities themselves rather than have to engage with the third party. Another big one to come out, and this is one I definitely want to focus on, was um, this law now permits consolidated reporting at the parent level for emissions. And that really alleviates the reporting burden on subsidiaries. And it also aligns reporting requirements across 261 and 253. So previously, SB 261 had said companies can report at the consolidated parent level and not have all individual reports at the subsidiary entity level. And 253 had not said that. And so now in the final bill, yes, you can do that. You can have consolidated parent level reporting. So those are our updates coming out of California. Big week for that state. And now let's shift it over to the other coast, the East Coast, my own coast, and talk a little bit about Climate Week in New York City. This was a really incredible event. It happens every year. This is a huge discourse on climate and other key themes, frankly, kind of plaguing our reality and society today. It's a weekly event or an annual event that is held for a week. This year it was September 22nd to the 29th. There were over 1,000 events, both online and in person, bringing together in a real global platform business leaders and policymakers, local officials, general public, and civic society, bringing them all to have a discourse, a conversation on how do we accelerate the transition to a green economy? How do we drive impact? This is hosted by a nonprofit group called the Climate Group, and it runs actually in partnership and concurrently with the United Nations General Assembly. So this isn't just a local event. You quite literally have world leaders all coming to New York to be talking about the most pressing issues. Now, this year's theme of Climate Week was It's Time. No hard guessing here on what that means, right? Despite a lot of amazing achievements, impressive investments in the energy transition and decarbonization, it's not enough, right? The time is now. We need to accelerate. We need to do more. We need to engage across the aisle collaboratively everywhere we can to really drive the impact that we need to achieve net zero and, frankly, avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. So it was really a call to action this year, asking corporates, individuals, governments to take that responsibility, take that action, take that initiative to get involved. Notable of this year's event, I will also mention, was a return in the vernacular to below 2 degrees warming. I think for the past several years, we've really anchored on 1.5 degree warming threshold. And so whether this was an official pivot or not, that is something I want to share. A lot of discussions on keeping it below 2 degrees, perhaps an indication, as many reports may suggest, that the 1.5 degree warming threshold may be slipping through our fingers. So just a couple of events that I actually wanted to chat about from my own ability to attend. I would say one of the key themes was voluntary carbon markets really taking a central stage. I would say every single session I went to that discussed them or dialogue that I had, there was the obvious acknowledgement of the controversy kind of plaguing this market and how imperfect it is, but also, frankly, a real kind of global agreement that channeling sustainable finance towards the VCM is a critical component of decarbonizing economies. And I had some really lively discussions with a whole host of stakeholders on the role of carbon markets in accelerating that decarbonization and kind of acknowledging the level of experimentation that's required to figure it out or to get it right, right? Because carbon markets are by nature the opposite of a physical commodities market. We're really good at that. But something like a carbon market, it's just a little bit of a different philosophy and, frankly, market dynamic and structure. And so giving ourselves the patience, the understanding, but also a little bit of the faith and commitment to figure it out, to iterate, to refine how the markets work, so that we can get them right in what is their ultimate goal of achieving, or I should say, of really channeling capital towards decarbonization initiatives and efforts to accelerate that transition to net zero. Uh, I also went to a really inspiring talk, a fireside chat of two really powerhouse CEOs, Patagonia CEO Ryan Gellert and Eileen Fisher CEO Lisa Williams. And they had a really interesting conversation on kind of the contradiction, the philosophical contradiction of capitalist-based consumerism and being a brand against sustainability. And I'll share a quote from Ryan, or I'll paraphrase in talking about Patagonia, that they don't consider themselves a sustainable company. It's not how they describe themselves, right? Sustainability is the idea of taking away less from a system than you give into it. And that's not what they're doing in producing clothing and manufacturing. But he does cite Patagonia as a responsible company, and that perhaps is a responsible company that they could be a model for how other companies may choose to do business, because it is still a business. It's just a certain kind of business. So that was just a little quote that stuck with me. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't add a really incredible talk by Workiva's own CEO, Julia Scow, on the stage with legendary Paul Dickinson, talking about the digitization and the digital transformation of decarbonization and the opportunity that companies have to right now to be both sustainable and profitable. It is not, in the words of Julie, either or, but both and. Really resonated with me and stayed with me. That's what I have for you this week. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will see you next week for another week in sustainability.
Workiva Carbon provides organizations with an easy-to-use solution to manage the full life cycle of measuring, managing, and reporting carbon emissions. Now integrated into the same platform used to manage the world's most trusted financial and non-financial reporting. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this show on our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. See you next week.